So for this video, I will be discussing the best sophomore novels, at least in my opinion. And by best sophomore novels, I mean the best books, the best second books written by authors. So not their debuts, but the books they wrote directly after their debuts, their second novels. And I'm going to split this into two parts in the same video. But the first part is going to be the non-sequels. So all of the books, the second books by authors that are not direct sequels to their debut novels. And then the second part of this will be the sequels. So sequels to their debut novels. And I believe I have 9 non-sequels and I have 6 sequels. So 15 books in total, the best sophomore novels written by authors. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right into it. So let's start off with the non-sequels, and definitely, in my opinion, one of the best sequel novels of all time. And I believe this author only has 2 novels. You can correct me down below if I believe there's only 2. I'm going to talk about Nessie by Susanna Clarke. This book is kind of a stark contrast between her debut novel, which was Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. That book I DNF'd like halfway through, 1,000-page tome. I really didn't get along with the writing style and just how incredibly slow it was. This book, I picked this up just because I was very curious, because she wrote 1,000-page tome and then she wrote this little 200-page novel. And I am head over heels in love with this book. I've read it twice now, really enjoy it. I love how weird it gets. I love the characters. It's just an amazing novel. And yeah, and this is her second novel, I believe, and it's incredible. A lot of people might not remember that this is Sanderson's second novel, his sophomore effort, but Mistborn, which is not a sequel to Elantris. It's still in the Cosmere, so if you want to argue that it's a sequel, whatever, but it's not a direct sequel to Elantris. Mistborn is his sophomore effort, and this is definitely my favorite of the Mistborn trilogy. Very solid first book in a series. I love this book. I love Vin and Kelsier. Give this book 4.5 stars. Just an amazing book, and not much else to say. Y'all probably know a lot about Mistborn, maybe even more than me. Kind of the Mistborn trilogy is kind of downhill after this book, because in my opinion, this is the best in the trilogy. Well of Ascension is fine, and The Hero of Ages is the worst Cosmere book. It just is. But Mistborn, very solid, and a very solid sophomore effort. And of course, I'm going to talk about one of my favorite authors of all time, and that would be Stephen King. And quiz, what is his second published book? Because his first book, y'all probably know, is Carrie, but what's his second? Good job. It's Salem's Lot. And this came out in 1975. Carrie came out in 1974. And for y'all that don't know, this is his vampire novel. Not one of my all-time favorite King books, but it is impressive because I'm not really a big vampire fan. My favorite vampire novel of all time is by my favorite author, George R. R. Martin, with Fever Dream. And this is a close second. I do really like this book. Again, not one of my favorites, but it's impressive because I don't like vampires, but somehow King manages to get me invested in his vampire story. So yeah, his sophomore effort, very good. Again, one of my favorite authors of all time, their second published work, very good. And that would be Fahrenheit 451. Just an amazing either novel or novella. I think he calls it a novel. But yeah, very good. And just one of my favorite pieces of fiction and literature, whatever you want to call it, sci-fi. Just so good. Give it 5 stars. It's so good every time that I read it. And it just has one of the most amazing first lines. It was a pleasure to burn. And then it only gets better from there. But yeah, one of the best sophomore efforts of all time. Still a classic today. And you guys know how much I love Jordan Sonnenblick and Drums, Girls, and Dangerous Pie. One of the most underrated books, one of my favorite books of all time. But what is his second novel that he ever wrote? Anybody know? Probably some of y'all know, but it's Notes from the Midnight Driver. And this book is amazing. Give it 5 stars. And kind of a similar vein, because you got a main character who's getting into some trouble, and they are music-minded, and it's just a very heartwarming story. It's very good, and it does have ties in with Drums, Girls, and Dangerous Pie. Some characters from that story appear kind of towards the end of this book. It's kind of a cool thing that he does, but it's just one of my favorites from Jordan Sonnenblick, aside, of course, from Drum Scrolls and Dangerous Pie. But this one, Sophomore Effort, does not disappoint. Again, another author that I believe has only written 2 novels, vastly different novels, by the way. But his second effort, obviously Sophomore Effort, is Imaginary Friend by Stephen Chbosky. The first book that he wrote was like The Perks of Being a Wallflower, which I believe is more like a young adult contemporary romance book. I've not read it. I don't know if I want to read it because it's obviously vastly different from this 700-page horror novel. One of my favorite horror novels I've ever read. It kind of is almost the perfect blend of like Stephen King and Dean Koontz. Like Dean Koontz has really interesting plot and details, and then Stephen King has really great character work, and you kind of get a little bit of both in this because it's such a wacky book, but the characters are at the heart of it. Just one of my all-time favorite horror novels. I can't wait to go back and reread this book whenever I plan to do that. But yeah, one of my favorites, and it's a sophomore effort, a very vast departure from his debut novel. Again, another horror favorite of mine would be Wonderland by Zoe Stage. Not quite as good as her debut novel, which would be Baby Teeth, which of course is one of my all-time favorite horror novels. But Wonderland, I think, is vastly underrated, has such a terrible rating on Goodreads. I kind of understand the criticism, but for me, it's just one of the strangest and darkest horror novels that I've ever read. I love reading this book. I've read it probably 2 or 3 times now, and it just keeps getting better every time that I read it. Definitely one of my favorite horror novels of all time. Another great sophomore effort, again, one of my favorite books of all time, is Blacktop Wasteland by S.A. Cosby. I've now read all of his books except for his new release, which comes out, I believe, in June or July, King of Ashes. But I've read all of his books that have been released, and so far, this is definitely my favorite. Obviously, Razorblade Tears and All the Sinners Bleed are both 5-star books. They're excellent. But something about this book just really hit deep with me. I loved the characters and just... I loved everything about this book. And S.A. Cosby, like, this is what kind of solidified him as one of my all-time favorite authors, even though he's only written 4 books or 5 books now. But yeah, this book is just on another level of how good it is. And it's definitely better than his debut novel, which is definitely my least favorite. Anyway, like I was saying, definitely better than his debut novel, My Darkest Prayer. I liked that book, but more of a 4-star book. And this was just a big step up in quality for me. One of my favorite books of all time. I believe it was my second favorite book that I read in all of 2023, just behind 10 Years of the Flesh. But yeah, this book, incredible. I can't wait to go back and reread it. Another great debut effort that's not a sequel is Krampus by Bram. And this is definitely my favorite Bram book. All of his other books have been either just pretty good or really good, but this one is just outstanding. It obviously deals with Krampus, and basically the plot of this book is Krampus versus Santa Claus. Terrific book, terrific premise, great character work, and just horrific things happen in this book, and it's overall amazing. I can't quite remember what his debut was. I think it was The Child Thief, which is still very good. 4.5-star book, but Krampus is just on another level. Great sophomore effort. So those were all of the non-sequels. So those were 9 non-sequel sophomore efforts. Say that 5 times fast. But now we're going to move on to the actual sequels. And these are all sequels to the author's debut novel. So these are not just sequels in general. They have to be sequels to the author's debut. So first off, I'm going to talk about Mr. Monster by Dan Wells. And this is, of course, his sequel to the debut, I Am Not a Serial Killer. One of my favorite horror series of all time. And specifically, Mr. Monster is incredible. It's my favorite in the John Cleaver series. And it's the second book in the series. It's amazing. It improves. It takes everything about the first book and just improves on it and just kind of ups the stakes even more. And it's just an incredible book, my favorite in the series, and just one of my favorite second book in a series of all time. Next up, we have The Dragon Republic by R.F. Kuang. This is obviously the sequel to The Poppy War, and maybe an unpopular opinion, because I think a lot of people, this is their favorite in the series. Probably my favorite in the series is still the first book, although I'd have to go back and reread the whole trilogy to kind of figure that out and remember it. But This is a very competent sequel, still a 5-star, amazing book, very competent sequel. So I think Poppy War, Dragon Republic are both 5 stars, and then The Burning God, like 4.5, maybe 5 stars. I didn't love the very ending of it, but the Dragon Republic, like I said, just an incredible sequel. Somehow the stakes just get even more raised and just more craziness happens, and Ren is doing more Ren stuff. And yeah, just very great sequel. Another fantastic sequel is Waking Gods by Sylvain Neville. And this is the second book in the Themis Files trilogy, which is probably my favorite trilogy of all time. It's either, I go back and forth between that and John Cleaver, but like this trilogy, it's definitely my favorite sci-fi trilogy of all time. But yeah, this trilogy is amazing. Probably still my favorite in that series is the first book. I tend to love first book in series more than the rest of them. That sometimes doesn't happen, but Sleeping Giants is amazing. But Waking Gods, like I mentioned with some other sequels, the stakes are even more raised, and it's definitely, you get to the end of this book and just craziness ensues, chaos. It's just so good. A lot of unexpected things happen in this book, and it's obviously 5 stars. But yeah, just one of the better sequels of all time. We also have Hidden Bodies by Caroline Kepnes, and this is the sequel to You. And this is, of course, the second book in the Joe Goldberg series, the You series. And yeah, it's just as good as the first book. I think probably my favorite books in the series are books 3 and 4, but the first book is certainly good. I'd have to go back and kind of reread them just to remember what happens in each of the books, but they're all very similar in nature. And the second book, like I said, is just as good as the first book. It's Joe Goldberg doing Joe Goldberg things. A lot of black comedy and horror in here. It's just excellent. And now we get to a book that I'm actually slotted to read in February because we have a read-along going for it over on the Bookastromer Discord. And that would, of course, be Red Seas Under Red Skies by Scott Lynch. This is the second book in the Gentleman Bastard series, and it's the sequel to The Lies of Locke Lamora. And again, The Lies of Locke Lamora is still my favorite in that series. I just love first books in series, apparently. But I will say the second book is just as good as the first book, at least in my humble opinion. All of the books in the series so far, 5 stars. This one is a little bit different because as you can tell, it does have a bit of a nautical theme. Kind of all of the books have a standalone quality to them. You still have to read it in order, but like each of the books tell their own kind of standalone story. This one is amazing, just as good as the first book, at least in my opinion. And I hope everyone has a great time with it in our read along. But yeah, definitely one of the better sequels of all time. And now we end the video possibly on a controversial note because this is my favorite book in the series, and every time I watch a ranking of this series, inevitably I hear people say, oh, well, if I had to rank all of them, they're all 5 stars, but if I had to choose one to get last place, it would be Chamber of Secrets. And I'm always like, no, Chamber of Secrets is the best. It's always been my favorite Harry Potter book, and it always gets shit on. It's so good. It's the best in the series. It's unapologetically my favorite in the series. It's better than the first book. It's better than books 3 through 7. Get over it. But yeah, if you couldn't tell, I'm very passionate about this second book. But yeah, Chamber of Secrets, definitely a very competent sequel to The Sorcerer's Stone or The Philosopher's Stone. But yeah, Chamber of Secrets has always been my favorite and definitely deserving to be on this list. At least in my humble opinion. Or maybe not humble opinion. All right, so those are my favorite and best sophomore efforts by authors. So again, these were 9 non-sequel books. So books that are like kind of unrelated to the first book, except technically Mistborn is in the Cosmere or whatever. And then 6 more that are direct sequels to their debut novels. So the 15 of the best sophomore efforts. Definitely let me know if you agree with any of my picks here or if you disagree with me. Leave those lovely comments down below. Also, what are your favorite sophomore efforts by authors? Are there any that I missed or left out that you're mad about? Leave it in the comments below. And of course, thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. Consider subscribing to the channel. And if you are already, thank you so much and stay tuned for more content. We also have the Bookastromer Discord down below, where I mentioned we have a ton of read-alongs and buddy reads happening every single month. And got my Patreon link down below if you want to support me there for as little as $1 a month. And I have my Amazon wish list if you'd like to purchase me a book. Thank you guys so much for watching and have a fantastic day.